A memory is what is left when something happens and does not completely unhappen. Edward de Bono. The fluorescent lighting's buzz was nearly inaudible to the three sinners below. The reptilian sinner who sat on the opposite side of the blue-tinted conference table was dressed rather informally, despite being in the presence of one of the most influential overlords of the Pride Ring. The overlord carefully listened to their ideas, half of which weren't even bad, every now and then cueing his assistant to write down some of the concepts that intrigued him. Vox had thought that this would be a waste of his already precious time, and yet, he still found himself genuinely impressed by the concepts that spewed out of the sinner's mouth. When the sinner finally finished up with the last of their notions, Vox sat up from his chair, and after neatly tucking his hands behind his back, strolled smoothly over to signal that the meeting was over, and quite a successful one at that. His assistant swiftly followed him with a clipboard in hand. Thank you. It was a pleasure doing business with you. Vox held his signature grin, extending his hand to the young reptilian, who shook with such an unexpected level of vigor that Vox had to fix his bow tie, which had gotten slightly askew. The young sinner, still shaking his hand at this point, began to spew out a jumbled mess of gratitude. No, thank you. I'm glad that someone as powerful as you would take the time to listen, especially this late on a Friday night. By the time the younger sinner decided to stop rambling their thank yous, and shaking his hand, Vox had begun to escort them out of the meeting room, feeling the gaze of his sharks eyeing them as they left the room, assistant trailing close behind. The sinner then ran off with newfound confidence, jubilation practically emanating from their very soul. Vox felt a distant memory resurface at the sight of this young sinner. They reminded him of himself when he was alive. Despite his whole brand being based on perfection, Vox was a rather crazy kid, with far too much bravado than what was considered normal. He would often play pranks on the neighbors with his schoolmates on Halloween night, or rather what it used to be called, Mischief Night. He and his close friends would dump their rubbish on the porches and doorsteps of those they deemed would have an amusing reaction. Sometimes he longed for those carefree times again, to live without the burden of consequences, for his actions to be disregarded, shrugged off with the saying, boys will be boys. But that was the past. He needs to be focused on the future. With a quiet sigh, Vox stepped over to his elevator. The doors opened automatically, and a whoosh of cool air welcomed his presence. His assistant followed Vox into the elevator, tail nervously flicking as he stood next to the overlord. The eel-like assistant brought a finger to the bottom floor button, Vox's floor. The TV-headed overlord maintained his broad, sharp-toothed smile until the door slid shut. Vox then heaved out a sigh, leaning back onto the railing of the elevator and pulling out his phone. He allowed himself to let loose, if only for a moment. Solemn few, including Vox's assistant, Peppermint, have been able to witness Vox release his carefully crafted facade. Vox has felt as if he wasn't even himself half the time. He'd spend the majority of his days working on projects or watching the denizens of hell down in his basement, or what Vilvet likes to call it, his man cave. Recently, due to Alastair's return, he'd been spending a lot more time down there, just in case Alastair had plans to counter Vox's plans. He could counter his countering so that his counter couldn't be out-countered. That's a word, right? Sir Peppermint started, nervously readjusting his glasses. What are you going to do now? You don't have any other meetings scheduled until Monday. Vox looked up from his phone, and a look of genuine surprise appeared across his digital features. Nothing till Monday. Yes, sir. Vox let out a sigh as his gaze shifted back towards his screen, thumb mindlessly scrolling through whatever media was crowding his feed. It was the usual. Hapless sinners cramming their useless products and businesses into short, unconvincing attempts at swaying their audience, practically begging for any sort of attention. He paused over an ad for a casino. Apparently, tonight was opening night, and the first 5 drinks and appetizers were free. It seemed like a rather good deal. Besides, it's been a while since Vox had had a night out. A while since all of the V's had had a night out. A night to be themselves. To sit in the VIP section and drink until one of them made a fool of themselves and had to be dragged out kicking and screaming by the sober V, which was usually Vox. A night for Vox to feel like a kid again, laughing and joking with his friends, just like he used to. So the sound of his assistant snapped Vox back into his surroundings. Peppermint looked onto his boss with nervous inquiry, clutching his clipboard close to his chest. Vox had realized he hadn't answered their question. His eyes darted around the small space of a room, thinking of something to say. I think you've done well enough today. Why don't you take a break? Peppermint's eyes widened in disbelief. It was rather unlike Vox to be generous like this. Vox would generally do the opposite, telling his employees to stay overtime. He watched as Vox stood back up from his slouched position against the elevator, fixing his hat and readjusting his suit as the elevator reached its destination. Why yes, Sir Peppermint nodded eagerly to Vox, who had stepped out of the elevator. He quickly scrambled to maintain his composure as this had never happened before, pressing the ground floor button. As the doors to the elevator hushed shut, Vox was left alone to himself and his sharks. He strolled down the catwalk to his chair, where he'd usually spend his nights watching Alastair, making sure that damned radio demon hadn't gotten up to anything deal-wise with the princess. If she makes a deal with Alastair, that would put him above Vox in power. Vox slumped into his chair, heaving out a sigh of exhaustion from the day. It was a Friday night, and yet here he was, alone. He had even sent his assistant to have the rest of the night to himself. Vox reached over his computer mouse to his coffee mug, which still had some coffee from this morning. Vox used his electricity to heat up the mug in his hands. Soon enough it was ready. Not too hot, not too cold. The perfect temperature for him. Vox lifted the mug up to his lips, or rather what worked as lips. The caffeine already re-energizing his systems, bringing his battery from 20% to 60%. Vox had personally never been one for coffee as a kid nor young adult. He'd only started to drink it when Rosie had offered him some at one of her new shops, back when he was still friends with. Vox slammed his coffee down, some of it spilling onto his well-tailored suit. Shit. Maybe he shouldn't have sent his assistant away. Whatever. He could clean it up later. Right now, he needs to find Alistair. Vox grabbed his mouse, and with a practiced movement, moved his cursor over to the camera feed file labeled Radio Fucker's location. The screens in front of him soon flickered on one by one. No, not here, not there. There he was, in his radio tower, broadcasting no doubt. Vox watched as Alistair crossed his leg over the other, speaking into his staff with his smug-ass grin. Vox hated that smile. He hated Alistair. But, if he hated Alistair so much, why did he care? Why was he even there? Vox knows, knew, Alistair. And he knows that Alistair would never believe in this redemption malarkey until he's double dead. Which is part of the reason why Vox has to keep his eyes on him. But, did he really need to watch Alistair? He knew the princess was naive, but not stupid. And it would take a while for little Miss Bleeding Heart to fall for Alistair's tricks anyways. Then why did he? Not that he was obsessed with him in any way. PSSHHT. No way. If anything Alistair's obsessed with. Oh, who am I kidding? Vox groaned, covering his face with his hands. He could feel his sharks staring at him, their gaze practically boring a hole through his screen. What the fuck you staring at? Vox stood up abruptly, making a rude gesture at them as he yelled into the practically empty abyss, his voice reverberating against the glass. But the sharks did not yield their attention. If anything, even more of them seemed to stare. God, I'm so pathetic. He slumped back into his chair, holding his head in his hands. I'm arguing with sharks. Vox whined self-loathingly, sluggishly looking back up at the glitching figure of Alistair on his monitor, who now was sipping his tea from his mug. Vox didn't even bother trying to see if it was his oh dear mug. It probably was anyways. Why was he like this? Could he seriously not move on? Just because Alistair denied his offer. It shouldn't have hit that deep. So why did it? Vox sighed, his gaze shifting to his pocket where he kept his phone, thinking about that casino ad he'd seen earlier. You know what? Screw it. He's having a night out. With the V's.